Imagine it's a Thursday on the last week of the quarter, and you're on your way to the boardroom, and you have an option A and an option B. Option A will help your company's stock appreciate 74%, or option B, which will help your stock appreciate 901%. Which of those options do you think you want to present to the board of directors? Hi, my name is Dutch Schwartz. I'm a cloud security strategist for AWS, and today I'll be giving you tips on how to build a culture of security. That original example I gave you about 901% appreciation of your stock price probably sounded pretty attractive. It's based on actual research done by John Cotter and Harvard professor James Heskett. They looked at 200 companies over the course of 20 years. And the single determining factor they could identify between super performance, that 901% appreciation, and lower performance, which was 74% over the 20 years, was based simply on did they have a strong or high performing culture, or did they have a poor or low performing culture? When they looked at all of the qualitative factors, high performing cultures outperformed the lower ones 128 times. And the only visual I could come up with for that is that's the difference between standing on the face of the sun or safely being in a space shuttle circling Mars, which is 128 times farther away. So clearly, positive, strong culture impacts the financial performance of your organization. Let's talk about your people. In a recent research study, when board members were asked about their top challenges, attracting and retaining top talent came in first place. This is their biggest concern that they have. So how does culture play a role in attracting and retaining top talent? The first way it has an impact is that in positive cultures, employees become brand ambassadors. And quite simply, it has a cumulative effect. In those instances, 71% of employees will then refer their own friends and former coworkers to your current organization. So that's a huge impact to attracting new talent. And then the second way is that talented people want to be in a strong organizational culture. And when they're interviewed, they actually ask questions that sound like, how will I be challenged here? What are my growth opportunities? What are the long-term plans for the company? That's very different from tactical questions, which lower performing people ask, which is things like, what are my benefits? How many days off do I get? And so forth. So performance is impacted, financial performance is impacted, and you attract and retain top talent primarily based on the culture of your organization. So let's look at a third way that culture has an impact. The third way that culture has an impact is specific to cybersecurity. In a research study done by George Finney, the CISO of SMU, he found that companies with positive cultures, strong cultures, had less breaches. Yep, you heard that absolutely correctly. Companies with poor culture had 3 times the number of breaches versus high-performing cultures. And note that I didn't say security culture, just the overall culture of the company. That has a significant impact and something tangible that you can point to. So let's kind of double click and look at one of the underlying reasons for that. One of the reasons that culture is important at an individual contributor level is that employees, when they're frustrated, they're stressed, unhappy, they make more mistakes, and there's good data that supports that. Of course, on the flip side, when you have a strong positive culture, employees are engaged, they ask better questions, they have lower stress, and they focus, right? They're less likely to make those mistakes when they get a phishing email, as an example. They're much more likely to be paying attention and actually to care about that. So at an individual performance and individual employee level, culture does play a huge role. So to recap, culture is critical in 3 primary ways. The first one is performance, financial performance of your company. The second is your people, your ability to attract and keep those great people within your organization. And the third impact is really at the heart of what we do, and that is it provides better protection. So a strong culture gives you the 3 P's: performance, people, and protection. So let's dive a little bit deeper into culture. One of the interesting things about culture is that for the leaders, for the executives within your organization, it's really hard for them to clearly see what the culture is. And this is an example that comes to us from organizational psychology, and you can read through that. And it's really interesting because culture often gets talked about when you're coming onto onboarding with a company, and when you first go through new hire process, and you may get a card, you may see posters, there might be great positive things about the culture, but then regular employees sort of go off and work separately or remotely, and it may feel very different to them than it feels to an executive within the company. And so this concept is called the goldfish effect, right? When you're actually swimming in the water, it's really difficult for you to actually see the water because you perceive it completely differently. So with that in mind, one of the questions I often get when I talk about building a culture of security is this sort of like vague feeling of, well, culture feels sort of squishy to me. Like, what really is culture, right? And this is a really common question. So what I want to do is describe some of the characteristics of culture to help you zero in and think about how you can impact that. So here's 4 key characteristics, and I'm going to really focus on the last 2 because I think they're worth highlighting. When the research is done about culture, what we find is that it's implicit, right? It's implied. In other words, it's not something that you put on that poster, right? It's sort of behavior that people observe and sort of the unwritten rules. So one of the things to recognize about culture is that it's an implied thing that happens, and so you really have to pause and think about it and really take a measurement of that to understand what it is. And the 4th one there is that it's enduring. And what I mean is that it's very challenging to just make an announcement and have an all hands meeting or a town hall and say, hey, we've decided to make some changes. And that's probably well intentioned, but you have to see it through. So making cultural change takes time. But the good news is that once you start to make that change, it makes a lasting impact. So culture sort of has a gravity, if you will. So culture is shared, it's pervasive, it's implicit, and it's enduring. So those are the characteristics that we can think about. So far, we've talked about the 3 Ps: the performance of your company, the people within your organization, and the protection, the actual cybersecurity aspect of your culture. We talked a little bit about how it's easy to sort of misunderstand what culture is, especially if you're an executive or somebody senior in your company. And I gave you some of the attributes, some of the characteristics to help you identify culture. So with that, the question then, of course, is how do we impact this, right? Where do we go from here? And there's really 3 key things that we can use to change the culture of our organization. So the first of those is you need to select a model. And I'll give you one today, but honestly, it doesn't really matter that much which of the models you pick. There are several, but you just need to choose one because that model that you agree upon then gives you a way to start thinking about your culture, and then you can begin measuring that over time, and then you can have some aspirations of where you'd like to try to change culture, and then of course you continually measure that. So I'll talk a little bit about how that works. The second thing is you need to tell stories, right? We actually really learn primarily through stories. So you have to engage with people from the executive level and throughout the company by telling them stories of what good culture looks like and what positive things come out of that. And the third thing that you can do is volunteers. A volunteer army always is better than a conscripted army. So a volunteer army in this case is the ability to get other people who don't have a title within cybersecurity to care about, believe in, and be passionate about security. So let's dive into those one at a time. So here's a model of culture. In this case, I've picked one that's specifically around cybersecurity. So this comes to us from Kaman Wong and Dr. Carrie Perlson at MIT. And I find that it's a good visual for people to kind of internalize the ways that you can impact culture. So we'll skip external influences because, of course, in a company, we don't really have the ability to change those. But we can look at the mechanisms, right, that are impactful inside of the organization. So let's look at each of these in turn. Beliefs are the things that we think are true. Values are the things that we think are important. and attitudes are the way that we approach things. It's sort of the way that we interface with the world, process information, connect with others, and so forth. So what you're trying to do is, as you attract and onboard talent, and particularly as you promote people into leadership positions, what you really want to do is understand the beliefs, the values, and the attitudes. You don't need to change them, but what you're trying to do is make sure that they align. So the red one in the middle, of course, is critically important. So if your organization has values around diversity, around sustainability, around impact to the world, then those are values that you want to make sure align with individual employees. And what you should be doing is looking for that in the hiring process, and again, looking for ways to tell stories when those values align, and when you have positive instances that you want to highlight. So beliefs, values, and attitudes all come together in a way that results in cybersecurity behaviors. And one of the underlying factors here is, instead of making sweeping changes that we know generally don't work with humans, with people, if you think about New Year's Eve resolution, right? I mean, so often those don't work because people try to make sweeping, huge changes, right? So what we know in the research from the last 10 or 15 years is that smaller changes, incremental things that are reinforced positively, are actually the way to get people to change or adopt new behaviors. So this is highlighted in a book called Nudge. And it's also highlighted in that Well-Aware book from George Finney, where he talks about building habits. So when we make small changes with positive feedback, we're much more likely to have an impact. So that's a way that you can build small incremental changes into your overall culture that will result in more security for your company. So I mentioned telling stories. And in this case, I'm kind of highlighting, you want to tell the right story. And I don't mean like a right or wrong, but I mean like a story that's authentic to your team, your company, and something that's, believable and kind of grounded in the right way that they'll understand it, right? And they'll kind of be able to internalize it. So this is a really simple example, and it's kind of relevant because we're in the month of October, right? So I've thought a lot about awareness and cybersecurity awareness, and I'm super upbeat on the fact that we need to have awareness, but candidly, awareness is just a first step, right? I can be aware of a thing, but it doesn't necessarily change my behavior, and it doesn't change the outcome, right, that we're trying to impact here. And this is a really simple example. As I did a poll, I was curious how people think about it, and secure culture actually was the #1 choice. That resonated with people. So this is just an example, within my own circle of people, but choose stories that highlight the kind of behavior that you want to applaud, and make sure that people feel good about making small incremental changes. And so choose stories and make sure that you socialize those across your organization. So we mentioned mental models, stories, and then the last thing I want to talk about is the volunteer army. So this is kind of a double meaning here, right? You see that I'm talking about the U.S. Army in this case. So let me give you a little bit of context. What the U.S. Army found post-Vietnam is that we looked through the statistics and we realized that the first hour after somebody was injured was the most critical time in terms of their recovery. And so there's kind of a nickname around that. The U.S. military calls it the golden hour. And so how do we address that issue, right? And what we found is there's just never enough medics. So I'm a former infantry officer in the Army, so what I can assure you is that if you're watching a movie and somebody in a war movie yells for a medic, there's not nearly that many medics in the real Army. So generally there might be 2 medics for 108 people. Okay, and that's if you're fully staffed, right? So often it's even less than that. So the military looked at it and said, well, what can we do knowing that we're never going to have enough medics? So the medics, of course, are an analogy for we're never going to have enough qualified, certified, experienced cybersecurity people. So what the Army did is come up with a program called the Combat Lifesaver Program. So it's a 40-hour program for any soldier to go through. So it's basically a week of training, and they really focus on 3 things. The first thing is to triage, right? Does this sound familiar? To assess the situation. The second thing that they're trained to do is to stabilize the individual. And then the third thing is to communicate what's happening. So there's some really, simple analogies there to the way that you want to think about building out a security champions, security guardians, whatever phrase works really well in your culture. But one way to develop that understanding and experience throughout your organization is to have a champions program. I've seen this myself at multiple organizations be very, very successful. We're just never going to have enough cybersecurity folks who are badged and trained as cybersecurity individuals. So you have to consider, how can I do gamification? How can I do fun learning? How can I give opportunities to people essentially to volunteer to become part of the security program? And we often think about that in terms of other IT folks, perhaps your software development teams or your product teams. But I would suggest you cast a wide net. There's really no reason that someone in HR, finance, legal, logistics, marketing, etc., couldn't be a security champion. And it would really work well, because then they can be the translator, if you will, within that team and help people understand. It also gives them kind of a safe place, right? They can go talk to somebody and ask a question around, hey, I was thinking about doing X, Y, Z. Is that really fit with our security program? And then they'll have a trusted person who's part of their team say, oh, actually, no, here's the way that we do that. Let me show you the wiki. Let me show you the website or the workflow or the approved, software that does that. So I really want to encourage you to think about a guardians program, a champions program, whatever, ninja, whatever works in your culture. But you really want to find volunteers, or else there'll just never be enough scale, right? You cannot get enough cybersecurity badged people to run your security program. So we've talked about culture and the 3 Ps. So it's very impactful to the performance, the financial performance of your company. And I promise you, if you say 901% appreciation of your stock, that should get any CFO, CRO, and the board, etc., really, really interested. So there's good evidence that a positive, strong culture impacts the performance financially of your organization. And we talked about the people, right? Having a strong culture allows you to attract and retain highly talented people. And we also know that when people are happy and they're engaged, they're less likely to make mistakes. So in general, companies that have poor culture are 3 times more likely to have a publicly announced breach. So the 3 Ps: performance, people, protection. Remember those are the 3 most impactful ways that culture is related to security. And again, the messaging here really is, I say culture of security intentionally. If we say security culture, there's sort of this impression that, oh, it's the security team over there. And if you think of sort of like old school manufacturing, and you had a quality team and a QC team, and you may still have that today, but if there's a group that is responsible for that, then sort of unintentionally the message that sends is, oh, well, then that's not my job, right? And what we're trying to do is sort of change that paradigm. Again, not a massive shift, but we're trying to make people first aware and then help give them tools and fun games and understanding so that they recognize that, hey, cybersecurity, security awareness is actually really part of everybody's job, right? And it starts to become a cultural norm. And if you remember those attributes of culture, it has a gravity, right? It tends to endure. So once you start to build this in, once you get a base of people who understand this, as new employees come in, they'll just sort of recognize, oh, this is just how we do work here. This is our culture. This is the way we do business. So that's the messaging around the 3 Ps. So what can you do sort of beyond this, right? Here are 3 resources that you can use to dive deeper when you think about building or tuning, if you will, right, your culture. So the first one is a collection of articles from Harvard Business Review. It's called On Building a Great Culture. And I've referenced a few of those earlier in my slides, but there's some great other models that you might want to look at, and maybe some will resonate differently with you, but there's ones that you can look at, quadrants, and there's 9 boxes, and there's a variety of things, but it gives you some good research-based ways to look at your culture. And I do want to stress that you absolutely can measure your culture. I've had CISOs and VPs say, oh, what, that's really hard. It feels sort of ambiguous. How do I do that? And you can do that. So what you can do is work with your chief people officer, your talent acquisition team, your human resources folks, and you can start to look at some measurements and just get a baseline. Where are we today? And it may not be where you think you are, but it'll be very interesting because it'll highlight that. So pick a model, start to do a measurement, and what you can do is then you ask questions, on a regular basis. Over time, you'll start to build up a body of data to understand where your culture is and where you can continue to improve that. So check out that book. The middle one you may have heard of, The CISO Evolution, written by Matthew Sharp and Rock Lambros. There's a great, the back part of the book, particularly the last couple of chapters, really talk about the human element. And so I don't want to steal their thunder, but check out that book, in particular the chapters around the human element and connecting with people. There's some great references in the CISO Evolution. And then the third one you may be familiar with, it's Start With Why. There's a series of other YouTube videos and some follow-on books from Simon Sinek, but it really focuses on the way that you engage people is to help them understand what their why is and align it with your why. And that kind of goes back to that part where I talked about values, right? So one of the important things as an executive when you're helping to move your culture in the direction that you want is to understand, why are we doing this? So it's incumbent on us as executives to say, where are we headed? Right, so that's typically thought of as the vision. Why are we doing that? That can be thought of as your mission, right? Like, what's our purpose here, right? Kind of our big why. And then you can kind of bring that down, scope that down into your individual teams. And then you want to talk about your direction and your strategy and so forth. So these are 3 good resources that I'll leave you with. And I'm really interested to hear feedback on this. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Here's an easy way to connect with me. And appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today about how to build a culture of security.